Hello and good morning, and you're very welcome to this morning's Signpost webinar. I hope you're keeping safe and well wherever you're joining us from in the world today. My name is Mark Gibson and I'm manager of the Teagasc Connected programme, and we're live with you this morning from a very snow-covered west of Ireland. So hope you're doing okay out there. Protected urea, we know, is a technology that we've heard a lot about in the last number of years. It offers many benefits, particularly in relation to reduced greenhouse gas emissions and ammonia emissions. And currently it's estimated that 5% of nitrogen used in this country is in the form of protected urea. So there's significant scope to increase this share. And to talk more about this, I'm joined by Dr. Patrick Forrestal, who's a research officer in soil science agronomy based in Teagasc, Johnstown Castle. And Patrick, you're going to give us an update on the latest research on protected urea. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Mark. Yes, I will.
So Patrick, and we have another Patrick as well joining us, Pat Murphy. Most of you know Pat is our head of Environment Knowledge Transfer Programme, also based down in Johnstown Castle. Good morning to you, Pat.
Morning.
So what's the weather like down in Wexford this morning?
Chilly, but not a sign of white around the place.
No sign of snow.
Oh, thankfully.
I think every child in the country is praying for more snow. So we'll see how it goes over the next few days. So Patrick, I know you have a comprehensive presentation for us, but before we go into that, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing down in Johnstown Castle.
Sure, Mark, and welcome everyone this morning. It's great to have you all on board here this morning. So this morning's presentation will focus on protected urea, but of course at Johnstown Castle we're looking, and across the organisation, we're looking for a whole range of solutions to help us meet the challenges that we know that are coming over the next decade, to allow us to continue to produce and to meet those environmental targets in terms of reduced emissions and improving water quality that are there. And you know, there are many avenues that are being explored, but I suppose protected urea is a particularly heavy-hitting option that we have on the table at the moment, and that will be the focus of this morning's presentation. And this is not, of course, to say that we aren't in my own program and across the organization exploring other options and technologies, a pipeline of technologies for the future.
Great. Okay. Well, look, maybe Patrick, while you're setting up your screen there, just to remind everybody that if you do have a question or comment for Patrick, or indeed the team here, we'd be more than delighted to put those questions or discuss those at the end of the presentation. So please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen if you want to send through those questions. And Patrick, I'm going to hand over to you, and we will talk to you in a little while.
Perfect. So thanks everyone for tuning in. And so as I was saying, we'll talk about protected urea, and I'll give a research update today. I have a little bit longer for this presentation, so we have a chance to go into a little bit of depth, see what's been done, and also there'll be some updates on some new research from the yield perspective, from the screening for potential for residues, and soil microbiology work that's going on from myself and from colleagues across the organization. And I want to acknowledge at the outset funding support from Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine, and also there was a number of Teagasc Walsh fellows who conducted their PhDs and are currently working on their PhDs on these topics. And all this work has come together to, I suppose, inform us on this topic. So just by way of overview, we'll talk about what is protected urea, as it's become commonly known here in Ireland, and some history and background to this. We'll talk about the greenhouse gas emissions picture, ammonia, yield, touching on nitrogen use efficiency as well, which of course is going to become much more important over the coming decade, you know, with potentially nitrogen availability being constrained somewhat. Also, I'll give an update on some of the preliminary work coming from the soil microbiology aspects that are going on, and the residue screening work. So to jump straight into it, what is protected urea? So for some of you, you've heard a lot about it, but others may know less. So essentially, what's become commonly known in Ireland as protected urea is urea made safe from ammonia gas loss by the incorporation of something called a urease inhibitor onto the surface of the urea fertilizer granule or in the melt of that granule. There are three registered urease inhibitors under the EC fertilizer regulations. Those are NBPT, a mixture of NBPT and NPPT, a closely related compound, and also 2-MPT. And these compounds can be added to urea fertilizer to improve its characteristics in terms of what we know is the weakness of urea, which is loss of ammonia gas. And this loss of ammonia gas occurs when urea is spread on the land, it attracts moisture, and through the action of the urease enzyme, this hydrolysis or conversion over to ammonium, which is half of what's in a bag of can, occurs. And it's during this process that we can have some of that nitrogen lost as ammonia gas. And essentially, this urease inhibitor is reducing this loss. So you might say, is this technology new? For many of us, we may have only heard about it in recent years, and there's been a lot of emphasis on it. Is this something very new? Well, Catherine Watson, who worked in Northern Ireland, here's a paper from Catherine published in 1990, so that's 30 years ago or so, looking at the effectiveness of the urease inhibitor, NBPT, for improving the efficiency of urea in ryegrass production. And what did Catherine report way back then, 30 years ago? Well, in summary here, that NBPT was able to reduce the ammonia loss from urea effectively. And for a summer application, it allowed urea with NBPT to perform as well as calcium ammonium nitrate and have the same level of nitrogen recovery. So 30 years ago, we knew that there was potential with this. So NBPT as a compound, let's talk a little bit more about it. I think this is worthwhile. Sometimes new compounds, people can wonder a little bit about what they are. So thanks to this gentleman here, Professor Rick Ingle, who's recently retired from Montana State University, we know quite a bit. He's done some nice work looking at that compound and its degradation. And I suppose given the conditions that we have in the country at the moment, where we have snowfall, Rick also did a lot of work showing that there can be quite high loss of ammonia from urea spread in cold conditions, in snow conditions, and so on. So that's, I suppose, quite relevant to us this week, where people might be thinking about that they might be safe in terms of loss just because it's cold. Well, that's not necessarily so with standard urea. And so in Rick's 2015 paper, he provides a schematic of the structure of NBPT, and you can see that it's a compound that contains carbon, phosphorus, nitrogen, and sulfur bonds. And NBPT is what's on the fertilizer in the bag, and that, when it's spread, drops its and hydrolyzes, it drops its sulfur bond and picks up an oxygen to produce the oxygen analog of NBPT. And it's this oxygen analog, NBPTO, which essentially mimics urea in the field. So when the urease enzyme comes along, it thinks it's got urea, but what it's actually got is the urease inhibitor, which blocks that active site of the enzyme. And of course, the bacteria will continue to produce more enzyme, which will in time overwhelm it. But and one of the questions that has come up, I suppose, has been around, what's the potential for NBPT to be there in the environment or to transfer? And I'll give you an update on the screening study, but just to understand a little bit of background around its degradation. So in this 2015 paper, Rick Ingle looked at the degradation of NBPT over time at different pHs. But in this example of soil 2, he had a pH of 6.1. And you can see here on the axis is time, and on the vertical axis is NBPT recovered. And you can see that that degradation over time was quite rapid. So there was sterilized and non-sterilized soil. So typically in the field, we'd be dealing with non-sterilized soil. So you see a rapid degradation in that NBPT over time, such that it's down to very low levels by day 2 to day 4. But NBPT, as I've told you, hydrolyzes to its oxygen analog, NBPTO. And note that there is quite a scaling difference here, and this just goes up to 20%. But again, you can see that there's very low recovery in the soil of this NBPTO. So it's on the granule, it's doing that inhibition, and it's degrading quite rapidly, is what we can see from this published work. Okay, so that's a little bit on the background. So let's jump straight into, I suppose, the very extensive work that's been done here in Ireland over the last number of years, which was prompted by the fact that we needed to find solutions for reducing emissions, and fertilizer nitrogen is a source of emissions. So as part of this work, which was again funded by the Department of Ag, we looked at nitrous oxide emissions, and that work is published, and it's there, I suppose, as an evidence base to inform, for instance, the inventory of emissions calculations. And this is Mary Harty collecting one of some more than 80,000 samples that were collected to measure emissions in this work. And I'll just take from that paper one example here. These triangles indicate calcium ammonium nitrate emissions after application, and you can see these spikes in emission associated with application of a nitrate containing fertilizer, whereas the urea-based fertilizers, including urea NBPT, commonly known as protected urea, were much lower. So there was a huge amount of measurement went on here, and when we boil this down to what was the effect on the overall emission factor from fertilizers, and this is something that's been taken on by the EPA, so they can actually quantify that at a national level. The emissions of the greenhouse gas nitrous oxide were higher for calcium ammonium nitrate compared to urea-based fertilizers. So about a 71% reduction here in the overall emission for urea NBPT. So this is a very large reduction, and you can't easily achieve this type of reduction. So reducing the nitrogen rate, as seems to be flagged for the coming decade, will help. But to achieve this level of reduction, you'd have to have a very large drop in the nitrogen usage. So we do need a certain level of nitrogen to keep our systems going and productive. And of course, that drives that capture of carbon through the photosynthesis and the production of a carbohydrate or grass, which feeds our animals. So because this work has been done, this provides the evidence to include this in the Teagasc greenhouse gas MAC. And you can see that their fertilizer type, or the adoption of protected urea, is a pretty heavy hitter in terms of the options that we have there to reduce emissions. It's up there with dairy EBI. On the ammonia loss side of things, again, we know what the emissions are here in the Irish conditions because we've measured that and we've also published that work. Again, that was funded by the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine in work in two projects that funding was secured by Carl Richards and Gary Lanigan at the time, and we published that work. And I've taken one of the temporal flows from these wind tunnels where we measured the emissions. And here you can see for a March 10th application, these treatments had no NBPT included, were urea-based, and you can see quite high levels of loss in March. So just because it's the spring and early on, if the weather conditions have low levels of rainfall, even with low temperatures, you can still have high loss. So it can play a role. In comparison with NBPT, or indeed the CAN, those ammonia emissions were much lower. So boiling this all down to, I suppose, what the national inventory sees, which is tons of these different products used and these emission factors applied. So versus urea NBPT has much lower emissions as a similar level to can. Slightly higher, but very similar. And because we have this evidence, it's again baked into the Teagasc ammonia MAC, which was recently published. And protected urea, again, makes up a significant portion of the option that we have there for reducing ammonia emissions. And along with low emission spreading, it's really those two that we have as options to do the heavy lifting to come down and get below our ceiling, which we actually exceeded. So this issue is right on top of us. So we can see in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions, the type of fertilizer that we choose makes an important difference, with protected urea having lower greenhouse gas emissions and ammonia emissions relative to the other two, which both have their strengths and weaknesses. However, of course, for a farmer, it's going to be, and for our productive capacity, it's really important that any fertilizer we use performs and provides the yield at a farm level. And actually, quite a lot of work has been done in this area and is ongoing. So I'm going to take you through that so that I suppose you can have a little bit more confidence around that topic. So we initially did cutting trials that again are published and which showed similar levels of performance. But in addition, Teagasc Walsh scholar Anya Murray currently with Brian McCarthy has grazing trials ongoing where the cow is in the mix. And in addition, we have long-term plots at Johnstown Castle where the fertilizer has been repeatedly applied to the same plots, and we can look at what the effects are there. So that's kind of, so there's some new stuff here to take you through. So I suppose in that original larger body of work that we did back in 2013 and 14, in those cutting trials, there were 3 sites over 2 years, but when you take all of the replicate comparisons and all of the timings into account, this work is published there. This graph here summarizes, behind it are 750 comparisons of these 3 fertilizers. So there's a lot of individual applications and timings behind this graph here, which shows us that in those trials, all of the fertilizers performed the same. There was no significant fertilizer effect, and the p-value on that was 0.9, so 9%. So it fell short of the 5% level that we might take to, which we would take to show that there was a significant difference. So essentially, those fertilizers were able to perform at a similar level. So this is good because we know that they perform differently for their emissions, so it gives us options. But questions arose. What about under grazing conditions? Is it going to hold up? And I suppose that's why this important work is going on with the grazing trials, which are being done in Clonakilty, Moore Park, Ballyhaise, and Athenry. And that work is ongoing. 2 fertilizer rates and 3 fertilizer types in grazing trials. And again, behind this, there are a lot of timing by replicate comparisons behind this work, which we often have to, I suppose, for these type of presentations, summarize into short order. So I suppose behind this, Anya is doing a lot of work. So a summary of this work for the last 2 years is shown here, and we can see that the yield performance between the 3 different fertilizers, can, urea with NBPT, and urea, is very similar. So very similar levels of yield between these. And indeed, when we look at the statistical analysis of this, these are p-values of 55% and almost 80%. So these are not statistically different. And also, this graph here summarizes the performance of these fertilizers across the growing season. The first bar is for can, then you've got the urea NBPT, and then you've got the urea. And if you look across the season, the yield goes up and down through the season, and you'll often see that there can be times of the year when where the yields are back a little bit, or the growing conditions are not not there, but generally speaking, the yield performance similar between the fertilizers. And so the summary which Brian put together from this was that there was no significant effect of fertilizer type on herbage production, no effect of fertilizer rate on herbage production, and they didn't run into any practical issues with using protected urea out on I suppose the plot or farm level in combination with the grazing, and that study will continue for another year. So I suppose this gives us another layer of confidence around its ability to deliver yield for a farmer.
Patrick, we have a question here in relation to the impact that maybe or the effect that soil type and soil moisture have on N2O loss. Could you perhaps comment on that?
Yeah, so this is a very important driving factor for N2O loss. And we saw that in the research that we did for the tillage soils, they had lower emissions relative to the grassland soils because they tend to be drier. But yes, this makes a difference. I suppose the thing is that sometimes it's hard to, so for the grassland soils, they also have high levels of labile carbon, which is another factor which drives that denitrification process and the loss of the greenhouse gas nitrous oxide. So when conditions are drier, yes, you can have lower loss, and when conditions are wetter, you can have higher losses. The issue is in our climate is that it's rather difficult to predict when that's going to occur. As many of you that are farming can know, often at various times of the year you can have conditions that get wet. And the issue that we have is that I suppose when you put nitrate into the system, it's sitting there either to be taken up by the plant, or if you get those wet conditions, the system is primed for loss through denitrification. And I suppose at a national inventory level, it's tons of fertilizer plus the emission factor, and that's how the national emission is calculated, and how we would get credit around reducing it. So hopefully that addressed that point.
No, thanks for that.
So to continue on the theme of yield assessment, and I suppose to give you confidence in how these fertilizers perform, one of the things that comes up regularly with farmers is that, well, sure, urea was yielding as well as everything else. Shouldn't we be getting some benefit from purchasing those more expensive fertilizers, such as urea with NBPT to do the protection, or indeed can? In those single year trials, we didn't see a significant difference. But at Johnstown Castle, I have in place these longer term plots, which you can see here to the right of your screen. And these plots are receiving different fertilizers, all of their nitrogen in that source continually since 2014. And we're just going to share with you some of the, I suppose, results from that. Just a preliminary summary of them. And hopefully in time we'll publish this also. So here's the yield for the urea plots over time from 2014 to 2019. I suppose probably what jumps up out there is that 2018, you see that much declined, a big decline in yield, which is attributable to the drought conditions. So we grew less grass in that year, and unfortunately it was also the year when we used more nitrogen fertilizer than other years. And if we look at the control plots here, we see them their yield declining after that first year. So the system's getting a bit tighter for nitrogen. So how did the urea NBPT do versus urea over the longer term? So while there was no difference in that first year, if we look at the trend here into the second year and over the ensuing 3 years before the drought, we do see at least a trend that there's some evidence of a gap in yield opening up between them. During the drought year, it didn't really matter what you applied, yield wasn't there. Water was the limiting factor, not nitrogen. And what about can? Again, this is somewhere intermediary. And again, in that first year, we didn't detect a difference. But I think this gives some insight. So this longer term trial shows us a number of things. it shows us that the single-year trial, while it didn't detect a difference, that longer-term trend is picking up some evidence of improved yields with NBPT over urea. And certainly over the longer term, you could expect that urea NBPT should be able to perform at least as well as calcium ammonium nitrate. So this longer term trial also gives us potential to answer some of the questions that are now coming in, which are, what about, what are the effects on soil biology over the longer term? And back in 2014, I suppose I was thinking ahead to what sort of, what kind of questions might we get over the longer term, and we're fortunate to have this in place. And I want to give John Murphy credit for keeping it running over the last number of years, which has been, a considerable amount of work. But it's now allowed us to look at things like impact of soil biology due to the repeated application of this fertilizer. So this is just a short summary of work done by Fiona Duff and Fiona Brennan, who's our soil microbiologist, looking at this longer term effect using these plots. So we're fortunate to have their expertise at Johnstown Castle and these plots to utilize. So we have a number of different fertilizers, and Ag-Climatise does leave the potential open for more, better, let's say, or improved fertilizers versus the conventional to be included there. So we have others, including nitrification inhibitors, but to look at the urea NBPT initially, we can look at a number of aspects of soil biology, and these are preliminary results which will be written up and subject to interpretation by Aoife and Fiona. But from an overall type of view, we can look at urea versus urea NBPT. And in this first graph here, looking at the populations, the total abundance of archaea, of bacteria, and of fungal communities, certainly these indications don't give cause for alarm that these population total numbers are shifting dramatically. Similarly, when we look at the nitrification and denitrification genes, similar effects across treatments. And Fiona and Aoife are also able to look more deeply into the bacterial population. So the total numbers are one thing, but what about who's there and the relative abundance? And we can see here that for urea versus urea with urease inhibitor, broadly speaking, these population numbers are similar. So some preliminary conclusions from this work, which is in the process of being written up at the moment. Similar composition and abundances across treatments. The functional nitrogen cycling communities were similar between the fertilizers, similar functions across treatments. And there was some evidence of or indications of impacts on nitrogen cycling with inhibitors. And we would expect this because this is really their function, is to interfere with nitrogen cycling, particularly in the case of the nitrification inhibitors. So I suppose something that's been keenly awaited, and which I'll provide an update on now, is this work that we've been doing, again funded by the Department of Agriculture and Marine under the NBPT SAFE project, which was a testing of samples, milk samples, for potential to contain residues of NBPT or NBPTO, so those specific residues. And I want to acknowledge and thank the team involved with this, both at Johnstown and Ashtown, to actually, this work was done last year, which was kind of a challenging time in terms of lab closures and so on. But I'll take you through now what was done. So as I showed you at the outset, NBPT and NBPTO are not stable compounds, so they're very susceptible to degradation. So they are, while they're stable in the bag on the fertilizer, and they have to be there at certain regulatory spec levels, which are checked by the Department of Agriculture. And when you put it out into the environment, into the soil environment, mixing it with water, with microbes, they're not stable. So if we were going to detect this in milk, the first thing we needed was a very sensitive method to detect it. And so that had to be developed from scratch. Also, a method had to be developed to preserve the samples so that they didn't potentially degrade from the time that they were taken to the time that they were analyzed. And so we went on to bulk and individual cow milk sample from the Johnstown Castle dairy. The samples were analyzed at the Ashtown Food Research Centre. So to give you a bit more detail on this, the bulk milk sampling was conducted from the overall Johnstown Castle dairy herd, and that was sampled. The data that we have to report at this point was sampled between February and September of 2020. And the average nitrogen rate for the whole herd was 181 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. And we did something a little bit different to what a farmer would do here, in that we applied all of the nitrogen on the farm as urea plus NBPT with a straight nitrogen. In this way, maximizing the delivery of NBPT to the platform. So P and K was put on separately using compounds. So typically for a farmer, urea with NBPT wouldn't be his only source of nitrogen, but that was the case here, if you like to exaggerate the risk potential. The samples were preserved and sent to Ashtown for analysis. The individual cow sampling was conducted on a 20 cow herd, which had a higher rate of 234 kilograms per hectare per year. Again, all as urea NBPT, and those samples were collected in June, July, and August, preserved for analysis and sent to Ashtown. So to take you through a little bit of the detail on the actual preservation of those samples. We're hearing a lot now about -80 freezers for preservation of vaccines. Well, a bit similarly, we collected the samples in these very small 4 ml vials. We also buffered the milk to an alkaline pH, which stabilizes NBPT, and the samples were preserved at -80 degrees to keep them stable. This is just an overview of how those samples were, then able to be, because of the small sample size, could be thawed out quickly and gotten through analysis. And that method was developed with a very low limit of quantification of the method, which is at 2 parts per billion, which is an exceptionally low detection limit. And to summarize the results, almost 180 samples there from the bulk tank. In terms of residue, all those samples were below the limit of quantification of the method, which was 2 parts per billion. Also in the case of the individual cow samples, 240 of them, all below the limit of quantification, 2 parts per billion. So what's the next step for this work? So again, this is coming available. We're working on the manuscript is being prepared for peer review and for publication, and that will detail the development of that analytical method, its validation, and in addition, summarize the results of that study. So I hope that during this presentation, I suppose, given you some deeper insight into just the level of research that's been done on this topic over the last number of years. And we can see that protected urea, or urea with a urease inhibitor, ticks a lot of boxes from, let's say, certainly from a farmer perspective, in that it has lower greenhouse gas emissions than CAN, lower ammonia emissions than urea, and we can get credit for this at a national level. And it can help our industry in that we can show progress towards reducing emissions. And this is going to be really important over the next decade in terms of, I suppose, what constraints might come on agriculture to help reduce those emissions. We've also seen in a number of different trial contexts that it is reliable for yield. And in my opinion, that's very solid. The preliminary indications from the soil microbiology work are positive. We're not finding a residue issue. And as I mentioned at the outset, those emissions reductions are verifiable, and agriculture can get credit for them at a national level. So I suppose the key thing now is that we get uptake of those measures that are there on the marginal abatement cost curve, and those include protected urea. Mark mentioned at the outset that uptake is at about 5% of the total nitrogen used last year. So this is a very low level, and there's a lot of scope for unlocking that mitigation potential over the coming years. And Teagasc is eager to work with industry partners and with farmers to ensure uptake of the identified mitigation measures at both pace and scale. And I suppose as part of that commitment, this new Signpost program has been set up, which is going to be headed up by Tom O'Dwyer. So I suppose expect to hear more about that in the coming years. So I suppose as a farmer, you might be wondering, what sort of options do I have, and how do I know that I'm getting, I suppose, something that has a urease inhibitor in it. So to help with this, on the Soil and Soil Fertility website, we have a list of the different fertilizers protected form of nitrogen there, and Mark will keep that list. Mark Plunkett keeps that list up to date. So I suppose there's 17 products there from 6 fertilizer companies. So there's a lot of potential options. If you can't get it in one place, well, there are other suppliers, and these contain these EC fertilizer regulation registered urease inhibitors, NBPT, NPPT, and 2-NPT. And these have regulatory minimum and maximum levels, which need to be there at the point of sale. And the Department of Agriculture sample randomly to ensure that this is the case. So you have that, I suppose, that level of comfort that you might expect when you buy a fertilizer product, that it contains the amount of nitrogen, for instance, that's marked on the bag. And that's part of that role. So there are options there with just nitrogen, with nitrogen plus sulfur, and with nitrogen plus potassium plus sulfur. At present, there's no P-containing options. But, the place, I think, in my view, to start with this is in the straight nitrogen slots in your program. So in your fertilizer program, your straight nitrogen slots or your N plus S slots are a good place to start. And protected urea can be used in spring and throughout the growing season. So I suppose one fertilizer to set up your fertilizer spreader for. And I mentioned that Teagasc is working on a whole range of, I suppose, other potential avenues which may help us in the future, including the potential for nitrification inhibitors to be added to fertilizer, and the role of other nutrients, the role of multi-species swards of clover, etc. And in my own program, Claire Aspel is a Teagasc Walsh scholar who's working on sulphur, and in work that's coming out from Claire, we're seeing that sulphur can boost yields, it can increase nitrogen use efficiency, and importantly, it can have effects on reducing nitrogen leaching. And Claire has currently a paper in review on that topic. So this is just a little summary where you can see that for a range of soils here, a benefit of about 10% to adding sulphur, and then another range of soils here, lighter soils, giving much greater levels of improvement. So I suppose for the response to sulphur can differ quite dramatically across soils in the country, but certainly there's evidence there that sulphur can do quite a bit to improve nitrogen use efficiency. And if you're a farmer thinking about your fertilizer program for next year, I'd encourage you to think about using protected urea, and think about using the protected urea with sulphur, and using a few grams of sulphur in your program there. So watch this space, I suppose, in terms of sulphur. I'm going to leave the last word on this presentation, which I suppose has gone to a deep scientific level, back out onto the farm. And we're farming at home ourselves, but Aidan Lawless is the farm manager at Johnstown Castle. at the dairy farm, and Aidan's probably one of the most experienced people in the country in using protected urea. He's been using it since 2016. It's now his main nitrogen source. And a few comments from Aidan are that it spreads in the same way as normal urea. So that's his practical experience over the last 5 seasons of using it. And of course, he was very familiar with spreading urea prior to using protected urea. At a practical level, he's noticing this benefit that because it's more concentrated than CAN, there's less refilling time. So 2 bags of CAN is 1,000 kilograms, covers about 10 hectares. He's blanket spreading the farm versus about 13 hectares for 2 bags of protected urea coming in at 750 kilograms. And again, a comment from Aidan, slightly cheaper product, but so we grow the same amount of grass. It costs us less to grow versus CAN, and we have lower greenhouse gas emissions. And I suppose in Aidan's words, in terms of meeting emission reductions, it's about the lowest hanging fruit I can think of. And I would agree with that statement. And I suppose at this point, I'll thank you for your attention and encourage you to use protected urea in the coming season. And I'll take any questions that there are. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks very much, Patrick. Excellent overview. Well, I suppose you took a deep dive there on a few occasions, but nice to see you coming up for air at the end there, and the practical comments there from Aidan Lawless, who you say is a very experienced farm manager down in Johnstown Castle. I think it's probably worth mentioning that protected urea is part of a wider suite of measures being recommended by Teagasc to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We've had some comments here about the use of clover, and of course this is a measure that should be aimed to complement the use of clover. Would that be fair to say, Patrick?
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned a number of times in the presentation, while this presentation is focused on protected urea, but it's by no means the only thing we're doing. It just happens to be that if you look at the marginal abatement cost curves, which detail the mitigation potential that we have, this is a heavy hitter that's there at the moment for us. But certainly clover is something that is going to also be very important. But with the clover swords, there'll be some nitrogen fertilizer used also. And so there's still a place for protected urea. So it's coming at this using all of the tools that we have in the toolbox. There's no silver bullet for the challenges that lie ahead of us in the next 10 years. We got to use all the technologies we can get our hands on and take them up and put them out at farm level.
You mentioned Tom O'Dwyer just in your presentation there in relation to the Signpost program, and just to let people know that we will be joined next week by Tom O'Dwyer, who's going to give us a presentation on the plans for the Signpost farm program which will be running over the next number of years. So a question here, Patrick, from Dr. Sebastian Lenz in Germany. So we have viewers all over the world this morning, and he's really, I suppose his question is in relation to the impact of these protected urea on the micro organisms within the soil, but particularly in the context of soil organic carbon. His motivation is to try and maximize soil organic carbon. I suppose he's looking for some reassurance there that this isn't going to affect the production of soil organic carbon.
Yeah, well, I suppose Teagasc as a research organization, as well as an extension and education organization, we have a lot of collaborations with different organizations across the world. We have this site at Johnstown Castle where we've had these repeated applications of the different fertilizers over time. And we can certainly look at that, and that's one of the parameters that will be explored. But I'd certainly welcome Sebastian to contact me if this is an area that he's interested in, because this resource that we have there at Johnstown Castle, I'd be happy to be corrected and to learn about other long-term studies that have this number of years of application. But this is a pretty unique resource, and we'd be happy to work with others that are interested in maybe utilizing that to answer such questions.
Okay, great. Lots and lots of questions coming through here. So Pat, you have a few questions ready
Yeah,
for?
I suppose one which won't be described as one of the simple quick questions, but I think it's a very comprehensive question which asks a lot. In order for NBPT to work and react effectively on land, what are the restraining conditions in relation to soil pH, soil temperature, environmental humidity, and soil moisture in terms of the operation of NBPT? So that's kind of when can you and when can't you, or when shouldn't you spread it?
Yeah, well, I suppose that the simple answer is that you can use it across a whole range of soils and across the whole growing season. So that's the simple answer. We use it across the whole growing season, across all different type of conditions and across different soils. To go a little bit deeper, I suppose as a nod to the question, which you could probably spend an hour answering, for instance, the pH of the soil does have an impact. If the soils are very alkaline, it's been shown that NBPT degradation is a little bit slower, therefore it can have efficacy over a longer period of time. Typically our soils in Ireland are in the acidic range, and it works well in these conditions, and these were the conditions that it was evaluated in. But I wouldn't see that there's any kind of obvious situations that you wouldn't be using it in.
Okay. A question here: have the rates of runoff been tested into groundwater or surrounded water bodies, or is there any other wider environmental concern?
Is that okay? So the question isn't really specific. So it could relate to runoff of the nitrogen fertilizer that's been applied, or it could relate to the urease inhibitor itself. So I'll address the nitrogen aspect from the first place. So because this is applied to a urea-based fertilizer, which converts to ammonium, which is positively charged, in comparison to a situation where you use a nitrate-containing fertilizer, which is negatively charged, there should be less potential for nitrogen leaching from the fertilizer, a nitrate form versus a urea or ammonium form. The second question is around the leaching potential for the, let's say, or I'm assuming that there could be asking about the leaching potential of the urease inhibitor. You know, I mean, the volume that it's used at is tiny in comparison to the volume of fertilizer that's used. And also, as I showed at the beginning, the degradation of that NBPT in soil, as demonstrated by that paper published by Rick Ingle in 2015. So that degradation is extremely quick of NBPT and NBPTO. So I think the risk is low, but we haven't measured it directly as of yet.
Patrick, we have a question here in relation to the rate of inhibitor that was applied in the initial studies on protected urea and in recent studies. And does this differ from the commercially available products?
Yeah, so I think this is a valid area, I think, for exploration. It's a valid area to question, and an important area. So for these urease inhibitors, they all have a regulatory spec, going back to their registration as under EC fertilizer regs. And Department of Agriculture check that they have to have the minimum level on them. So the initial work was done at a loading rate of 660 ppm of active ingredient, and the fertilizer products that are around the market currently can have lower content and still be within the regulatory spec. Let's say for a greenhouse gas perspective, that's not going to make a great deal of difference, because you've got a urea-based nitrogen, and it's really because you've got a urea-based nitrogen that you're getting that reduction in nitrous oxide emissions compared to a nitrate-based fertilizer. From an ammonia emission perspective, we chose that particular level of NBPT because that was what was shown in previous studies to give a near maximal reduction of ammonia loss. using NBPT. And there is some reduction as you go down in the rate of the urease inhibitor, but not massive. It doesn't fall off a cliff. And again, Catherine Watson, who I mentioned at the very outset with her paper in 1990, has a nice study which shows that impact of rate versus efficacy. And in New Zealand, where now about 35% of the nitrogen that's used there is as protected urea with urease inhibitor, they do use a lower NBPT treatment level than is typically used here in Ireland.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. Just a question in relation to, like, traditionally urea, we would always recommend not to be spreading it during, dry weather, hot weather, because of the risk of volatilization and loss to environment. Is protected urea a much safer product to use in those environments and during those conditions?
Yeah, I think this is a good practical question. This is what the protected urea is for. That's why you're paying for the protection over ordinary urea, is that insurance that when you go out and spread, you don't have to be worrying about those conditions. And yes, that can happen in the summer, but that could happen in March as well, when conditions are cool but dry, or you get that harsh weather. And I showed that in the presentation as well. In fact, one of the highest losses from urea that we measured was for a March application. And that's what the protection is doing. It's basically bringing urea up to the level of CAN.
Maybe a few quick-fire questions there. Has an acceptable residue limit been established for NBPT? And I suppose this harks back to, I suppose, Sinead's talk last week, in which she talked about DCD in this context.
Yeah, not that I'm aware of, and I suppose this can be an issue with compounds. What's the maximum residue level? And I suppose when you get into the detail of residues, Martin Danaher, who's also working with me on that project for the screening of the milk, this is more his area of expertise, because he's screening for residues of all sorts of different things. Yeah, I mean, it would be good if for all compounds we had these type of maximum residue levels. But again, I'll point you to the results that we saw where we didn't find it. So if you don't find it, then
and there is toxicity work has been done on it as part of its initial registration years ago as well, I think.
Yeah, there's a lot of there's reams of information available to be read if
you're inclined. The question: does protected urea product have a best before date? All right, I suppose the question is how long does it last, or how long does it remain effective?
Yeah, this is another, I suppose, important technical question. So we know that it can degrade during storage. That's correct. And in the studies that I demonstrated to you there, and those published works, we got fertilizer at the start of the year, and we applied it throughout that year, and we were also measuring its emissions so that we could see that it was doing the business throughout that growing season. So what I would say as a rule of thumb is that if you're getting fresh product at the beginning of the year and you're spreading it throughout that growing season, there shouldn't be an issue with it. On top of that, you have, I suppose, that confidence that's there in terms of Department of Agriculture as a regulator checking that these products fall within their regulatory spec for content. Seen various storage studies which can show that the shelf life can extend, well beyond 12 months. Worst case scenario, even if everything degrades, right? Even if you buy fertilizer here in February and you have a bag or two left over at the end of the year which you haven't used, you'll be spreading it next year. in the early time of the year. And the worst that's going to be is like ordinary urea. And this is very unlikely that it would have completely degraded at this time. But I think it would be helpful to have, some detail around when they're packed on the bags, just for the farmer. Yeah.
A quick one. Are the laboratory tests used in the studies mentioned reliable, validated, and accredited?
So if this is in relation to the residue testing,
yes, it is.
Yeah, so that is currently been written up. So that paper, is validated. So the method also was put through a validation test. So that paper will describe the development of that method and the validation study to check that it actually was measuring what it was supposed to be measuring, as well as reporting the findings of that screening study. So the answer is yes.
Can protected urea be spread with soon after application of lime, or do you have to wait 3 months?
So I suppose, like anything new, there'll be, there'll be, important questions such as this one that I think need a bit more work. So I think there's a little bit more work needs to be done on this. What I will say is I did run in the lab just a quick look-see of protected urea put straight onto lime soil, and the indications are positive. But since a national liming program and also widespread use of protected urea are kind of flagged, I think that question deserves a bit more attention. And I think that's important. It's also an important reason why we should take the knowledge that we have at the moment, which I suppose taken pains to describe that there was a lot of work went into it, and take it for what it is, and that the limited resources focusing on answering these type of important questions.
We know, Patrick, that there's a lot of nitrogen in this country spread as compound fertilizer. What are the prospects of us seeing a compound that includes protected urea? How compatible is it with other elements?
Yeah, so this is a good question, and the question around P comes up a lot. So I think that there is potential there, but let's take a step back for a moment and look at where we are today, right? So last year we were at about 5% of the total amount of nitrogen used as protected urea. So there is a lot of opportunity to incorporate protected urea into the straight nitrogen or N+S slots, where we know that the compatibility aspects are much more sorted out. So if you're a farmer that's spreading a straight nitrogen or a straight N+S, you've got a potential to use a straight N or a straight N+S product. And for me, that's where we are at the moment, is to start there and work on that, and let the compound aspect be something for further down the road, because we've got quite a journey to go on if we're going to unlock the mitigation potential that this has at present, and we're quite a ways from doing that.
Just sorry, Pat, just there is a question here which I think is an important one. A lot of the discussion has been in relation to protected urea used on grassland, but has there been work done in the use of protected urea in tillage crops?
Yes, there has. We also did a body of work on tillage crops, and I suppose it's important to distinguish that what we're talking about is use of protected urea in grasslands. In those drier arable soils, which I did mention in the presentation, we didn't see a difference in terms of nitrous oxide emissions. So for the tillage soils, farmers can continue to use calcium ammonium nitrate, nitrate type fertilizers. From a greenhouse gas perspective, protected urea is there as a potential fertilizer option, because obviously they're going to, I suppose, use what's available. But what may become an issue, depending on what way the policy goes, is access to urea, for instance. Urea is there as an ammonia emitter for us nationally, and so using protected urea in place of urea would reduce that national ammonia emission. But urea is probably a lesser source of nitrogen in the tillage setting, typically anyway.
Question there about any work in relation to improving the footprint of calcium ammonium nitrate as opposed to switching to urea.
Yeah, I think that's a valid question. You know, what we need over the next decade, you know, it's flagged there, you know, I suppose in acclimatized in the European Green Deal, you know, potentially reduced use of fertilizers, including nitrogen fertilizers, and that in itself will help reduce the emissions associated with nitrogen fertilizer. And we're going to need to do more and more to hang on to the nitrogen everywhere that we can get it through low emission spreading, by improving nitrogen use efficiency, liming, other nutrients, for example. I think it's just remind me of the question there again. Sorry.
No, is there any prospect, I suppose, that a protection for CAN will come?
Yes. Yeah. Sorry. I think it's probably valid to explore this. Half of the CAN is in an ammonium source. Could a nitrification inhibitor play a role there, or the strategy times nitrification inhibitor? But generally speaking, for the conventional fertilizers that we have, if they were going to deliver the solution, I guess we would already be there with the solution. What we need is nitrogen fertilizers that are better than the conventional fertilizers. So I suppose that the challenge is there to see what can be done in that space, in the pipeline of solutions over the coming years.
There's nothing imminent anyway, that's I think the point.
Okay, Patrick and Pat, we're a little over time, but I think it was important to address some of those key questions, and lots more questions here that just unfortunately we don't have time to get to. So what we might do is we'll send you on a list of those questions coming through, Patrick, and if there's any that we feel that maybe we haven't addressed, we might take the opportunity to do something in the future on protected urea, because it is such an important pillar of our agricultural response in Ireland to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So Patrick, thank you so much for a very, very comprehensive presentation. Patrick's presentation will be available on the Teagasc website over the coming days, as well as a recording of the webinar if you want to go back over any of the details that Patrick went through today. So thanks again, Patrick, and Pat Murphy, thank you for assisting with the questions. And also thank you to our production team, Andy Boland, Catherine Keena, Pat Murphy, and Yvonne Maher, without whom any of this wouldn't happen, because there's an awful lot of work that goes on in the background in terms of getting ready for each of these sessions. So we do share appreciation for the work that goes in. Also, if you want to receive updates on training and latest publications from Teagasc, we encourage you to sign up to Teagasc Connected Digital. And what we might even do is talk to Mark Plunkett about that list of protected urea that is available, and see if we can circulate that to our Connected Digital subscribers. So look, without any further ado, thank you for watching, and we look forward to next week. We'll be joined by Tom O'Dwyer, who's the new head of the Teagasc Signpost Farm Programme, and which is the Teagasc campaign to deal with climate and reducing greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. So until next Friday, thank you for watching, and we will have a safe week, and we'll talk to you next week. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.